one of the things I always tell landowners is you should never be investing your own money into this market because these carbon companies are willing to pay. Yeah, and it's kind of like if you didn't know about it, you're kind of SOL. You missed out.
Right.
But writing a clause in your contract that says, if I don't make X dollars per acre by year 5, then I want to be able to get out of this contract. If you're not making any money, it doesn't make sense to keep in. If you're not making money, the carbon company's not going to make money because they take a portion of the revenues.
Welcome to the Modern Land Investor. I am your host, Michael Warren, with my co-host, Chris Clark. And today we are super excited to have Nikki from the University of Wyoming. Did you go to University of Wyoming? You did, didn't you?
Yeah, so I got my PhD at Wyoming, and then now I am an assistant professor and the range management extension specialist.
Amazing. Yeah. So we're going to start diving into some unconventional topics here for typical land investors here, but we're going to be talking about some really cool things that Nikki's spent some time discovering with carbon credits and just some alternative things that a lot of land investors don't really know about. So before we really dive into the details, Nikki, we do kind of ask our guests to kind of give their superhero origin story. How did you come to be where you are today? So if you wouldn't mind, just start from wherever you want to start from.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for having me on the podcast. So I have always been really interested in agriculture and food production. I grew up in Montana around agriculture and spent some time in Idaho and Georgia for my undergrad and master's degrees. Georgia was really interesting because I got to see a lot of different kinds of ag than I was used to seeing, like row crop, scale production, places where people complain about getting 40 inches of rain a year. So that was really interesting. And then I had the opportunity to come back west and come to the University of Wyoming for my PhD. And my PhD primarily looked at how grazing management can impact soil carbon sequestration in arid regions like Wyoming and Colorado, and how that can directly impact producer profitability and potential in the carbon market. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about carbon markets, and I started thinking about them in 2023 when they kind of had a revamp from the Chicago Climate Exchange crash where carbon credits were selling for pennies. And, it kind of had this revamp. They came back, and especially in agriculture and large landscapes that are not dominated by timber and are primarily used for grazing. And I've mostly thought of carbon markets through the mindset of landowners and producers. However, I understand the real estate space is starting to get into this carbon market realm. And so last year I developed a course for the Wyoming Real Estate Commission. So kind of giving real estate agents an idea of what they should think about in terms of carbon markets and selling land. So that's a little bit of my background and why I'm still thinking about carbon markets. It's interesting because carbon is kind of a political term at this point, unfortunately. But there's a lot of opportunity for landowners and producers to join the carbon market and potentially make money from the carbon market. And if they can't make a lot of money, there's still room for other benefits, like benefits to the land, as well as infrastructure developments on a property. So yeah, that's a little bit about my background.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. And thanks for coming on. We're super excited about this. So if we could just go back real quick with the program that you had created for real estate brokers, if you could just at a high level, maybe throw out a couple big takeaways that you think these real estate brokers, they kind of walk in, they don't know very much of anything about carbon credits, and how can they open that discussion with people that they work with?
Yeah, so kind of the premise of carbon markets is the idea is you want to increase soil carbon sequestration And that is just the process of carbon dioxide being taken from the atmosphere and put into the soil through photosynthesis in plants in the form of soil organic carbon. And so across all the different carbon markets you can enroll in, which there are a variety of different ones in the timber industry, renewable energy, methane capture, all of these things, I focus specifically on agricultural related carbon markets. The foundation of all of these different markets, though, is you have to change management in some way that aims to increase that process of soil carbon sequestration. So in ag, that's typically move your cows more, rest pastures longer. It could be putting land in a conservation easement, and that's the management change. In row crop agriculture, it could be reducing your nitrogen fertilizer, diversifying your crop rotations, interseeding, something of that sort. Some practice that we know from science potentially increases soil carbon sequestration. And the market has totally transformed, like I said. And these newer companies that are funded by big dollars from Shell, Microsoft, are willing to pay for all of these management changes, which is really important for me for thinking about the landowner and where they're at risk. One of the things I always tell landowners is you should never be investing your own money into this market, because these carbon companies are willing to pay for you to make management changes. And that could be putting up more fence, subdividing pastures. It could be virtual fencing. There's companies that are paying for virtual fencing, or it could be for a soil organic amendment. And so these companies are willing to pay. You just have to be willing as the landowner to sign a contract from anywhere to 5 years to 30 years. And so that's the commitment on the landowner side, is making a management change and committing your time. But those are kind of foundational things of the carbon market, no matter what sector you go into.
Yeah, and maybe we could do like a little carbon credit, carbon market 101. And because I think, it's a topic that we don't really touch that much in our, at least for land investors that are probably listening now. They're not like brushing up against carbon credits every day. But what is a carbon credit? Why do carbon markets exist? Like, how are they created? Who's behind them? And like you mentioned landowners and then producers. Is a producer like a farmer?
Yeah, so a producer is just someone that's producing an agricultural commodity, whether that's
Gotcha.
vegetables or beef.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. That makes sense. Just want to make sure we know all the definitions here. But yeah. Maybe if you could just talk through like, why do carbon markets exist in the first place? When were they created? And then what is really like a carbon credit, and how do we think about that?
Yeah, so I guess starting from the beginning, a carbon credit is equal to 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents sequestered into the ground or avoided from tilling. And so, what's a carbon dioxide equivalent? Well, when people think, or these carbon companies think about all of the emissions that come from an operation, they're thinking about carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. These are different forms, these are different molecules. And so they convert them all into a carbon dioxide equivalent so they can compare apples to apples, basically. And so that's what a carbon credit is. And how is that measured? Well, that's typically measured through soil sampling. And so how that works is they'll come year zero before any management change has been made. They'll take baseline soil samples, and then it's the landowner's responsibility to make that management change, like I talked about earlier. And then that carbon company will come back every 3 to 5 years, resample in those same places. And however much soil organic carbon has accumulated is the number of carbon credits that will be issued. The other side of that is conservation easements. That's a route you can go because you're legally showing that you're not going to till or build on that land. Therefore, you're preserving all of that carbon that's already in the soil. So you're avoiding the loss. And so they don't typically physically measure soil. They just kind of model what they think you're keeping in the soil from preventing tilling. So that's kind of the foundation of what a carbon credit is. in terms of why this market exists, that's where it can get people a little fired up, because the purpose of the carbon market is so these companies can buy these carbon credits, therefore say that they're reducing their carbon emissions. But a lot of times they're not actually reducing their emissions. They're just buying carbon credits from landowners who have accumulated soil carbon. And I remember, I think back in the early 2022 time, Delta Airlines was saying, "Oh, we're going to go carbon neutral." And whenever you buy a flight, you can see they show your carbon emissions, which is so funny. But Delta was saying we're going to go carbon neutral. They cannot go carbon neutral because we cannot fly planes without carbon. What they were doing is buying carbon credits. And so they ended up getting sued because they were misleading consumers, saying that they're reducing their carbon emissions, when really they're not. They're just buying these carbon credits. But the idea is that companies buy them so they can appear environmentally friendly to consumers, and maybe consumers will want to purchase more of their product or service. So that's why they exist, and that's what a carbon credit is.
So they're speeding, but they don't care about paying the ticket. They'll just pay the ticket almost in advance and say, you know what, I'm still doing good here, but I'm really breaking the law every day.
Yeah, and the idea is that these companies are supposed to be doing everything they possibly can to reduce their emissions until a certain point when they can't do anything else because technology just isn't there. And that's when they buy the carbon credits. But whether that's truly happening is, I think, up for debate.
Right. I mean, I guess if they are forced to buy the carbon credits, then they'll change their behavior perhaps if they can. I mean, an airplane that Delta's flying that's a technological change that just may not be out there right now, right? They're not going to fly electric jets necessarily at this point, and they may just not be able to do it, so they have to buy carbon credits, right?
Yeah, and most states, the carbon market is voluntary. So companies are voluntarily buying carbon credits to offset their emissions, but there's certain states like California where there's the cap and trade market where companies have to stay below a certain number of emissions or they get taxed. So, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. All right, so it's voluntary. So that is what's really creating the market. Let's just keep Delta as the example. They want to appear green. They want to appeal to their customers, and they want to sell more seats. And so they're saying, listen, we're going to go carbon neutral, or we're going to offset, our usage and our carbon outputs, and we're going to buy these carbon credits. So don't feel so bad if you have to fly on Delta versus maybe Southwest that isn't doing that. So it's really like a capitalist move on their part, and that's why the market exists. Is that right? Aside from maybe California.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And honestly, even with a change in administration, whether it's a Democrat or it's a Republican in office, the market hasn't changed substantially. And there's still demand for carbon credits, specifically from nature-based carbon credits like those created on ag lands in the US.
Gotcha. So when the carbon markets tanked, I think you were mentioning this, did they tank because carbon credits got too expensive, or was it kind of a function of people were not, companies realized that maybe people didn't care that much and they weren't, able to sell more seats on their flight or whatever, and they just decided to stop buying carbon credits? Or what was the reason that, the value of a carbon credit went down so much at that period of time?
Yeah, so that kind of happened in the early to mid 2000s when we were already having economic troubles in this country. And I think the main driver was that supply was a lot larger than demand. There were just not that many companies who were even interested in reducing their carbon emissions. That conversation wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And with just more people caring about how their purchases impact the environment. That's why I think demand has been so high from these companies, because they want to appeal to that growing sector of consumers who actually care about, what they're buying, who they're buying it from, et cetera.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Interesting. Well, with a landowner that, is, let's use a landowner that is just a landowner and they're not, say running cattle or, farming. If they wanted to take advantage of, you know, I guess selling carbon credits and they didn't want to do a conservation easement, is there a play there, or would the play for them be the conservation easement?
Yeah, well, I guess it just depends their goals. And so if they want to put their land in a conservation easement, it kind of goes hand in hand with the carbon market. And specifically in the carbon market, it's called avoided conversion of grasslands. That's the protocol in the carbon market. And so you can get paid upfront for the easement and then get paid annually for the duration of your carbon contract for 30 years. So I'll give you an example in Wyoming. And just keep in mind, in Wyoming, we're high and dry here. So potential might be greater in states outside of Wyoming. But um, I was consulting for a landowner who had about 4,000 acres, and he was very interested in going the conservation easement route. And they basically told him, of those 4,000 acres, only 800 would be eligible for the conservation easement route, because they're going to look at your property and make sure, is there actually a risk of this property being converted? Not as much in Wyoming. If you're in the Midwest, absolutely. Because they're not going to, you're not going to prove that you're preventing tilling if tilling isn't going to happen. So they said, of your 4,000 acres, we'll enroll 800 acres and we'll give you 25 grand up front for the conservation easement, and then about $2,500 annually for 30 years. So all in all, it wasn't a lot of money considering the fact that he was going to be tying up his property. So he was not interested, but that's kind of the idea of the conservation easement route. Alternatively to the carbon market, if you're not interested in signing up for these long-term contracts, sometimes people will buy a neighboring lot that could use some improvement, and so they'll call their NRCS person and put it in a grassland CRP for 5 years and get paid. So you're getting payment and you're helping improve it by resting it, maybe. If you're someone who's actually interested in the tax benefits that come with ag, buy some cows and or maybe find someone who's looking for ground, and you can easily look at implementing some kind of rotational grazing program. Science shows that sustainable grazing has a lot of environmental benefits, and what people don't realize about organic carbon is it typically is about 50 to 60% of soil organic matter. And we all know soil organic matter is the foundation of soil health, that when you increase soil organic matter, you increase water holding capacity, you increase nutrients, which is critical for plant growth. So all of these things are linked to organic matter, and organic carbon is the vast majority of that. And so there's benefits from hitting it hard with cattle, getting that natural fertilization from manure and urine. When cattle graze, they can increase the photosynthetic capacity of those plants by eating old plant tissue. So younger plant tissue grows, reduce shading, all of these things, that there's benefits from grazing. And so if you're looking to invest in land, but you're not a rancher, there are plenty of people looking for ground to graze on, especially in the West this year where we are in severe drought. So that's something you can think about as well.
Do you have to have, sounds like, I think you mentioned 5 acres in that example of the neighboring lot. You don't have to have a ton of land. It just has to be suitable for these carbon credits, right?
Well, it depends the state. In Wyoming, they probably won't enroll anyone under 1,000 acres, just because, it increases with size, meaning more acres enrolled, more profitable a project can be. And so one thing you can do is send a carbon company a map of your place, and they will run it in some programs that they have and give you an idea of how much soil organic carbon they think you can accumulate, and therefore how much money they think you could make if you implemented a rotational grazing management plan. And so before you sign up, they'll give you an idea of how much money they think you can make. And one of the things I always tell people that I talk to about carbon markets is you should absolutely shop around between different companies. It's like buying a truck. You're not going to buy a truck from the first dealer you go to. Maybe shop around a little bit and see, what changes they might want you to make. Although they're typically the same, but they'll differ in what they'll pay for and how much money they'll pay you.
Okay. How do you find one of these carbon companies that, or all of these carbon companies, and kind of shop that around?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends the space, the sector you're going into in terms of agricultural lands. Some of the big ones are Grassroots Carbon, Cultivo, which used to be Kateri, Native, Indigo. These are companies that are out there. You can Google carbon companies and fill out their website information and request a contact. Although I'd be careful with that because they're salespeople, so they will be calling you. But and ask for their contracts. And I've been working with some lawyers, although I have no law background at all, but working with lawyers on how we can strategically negotiate these contracts. Because a lot of them are like, I've never seen something like this. I don't even know what to do with this. So I kind of try to help them with my expertise on the environmental management side, and then they come in with the law side. But yeah, just I think a quick Google search in terms of if you're outside of ag, that's not my specialty, but you can find a variety of companies.
Yeah, and this is awesome that we're diving in at this level of detail. So I think a lot of our listeners have probably heard, at least by now, if they're listening to us, the term of the conservation easement, right? And what that vehicle can do. But I wasn't aware that it would go hand in hand with the carbon credit program like this. And so how often do you see people who may have purchased a property that already had a conservation easement, or they're going through or went through the conservation easement process, that property has now been restricted for use and they are unaware of this additional revenue opportunity, or even the ability to improve their land at no cost to them while generating revenue? I mean, that just seems like a whole market in itself.
Yeah, and it's kind of like if you didn't know about it, you're kind of SOL. You missed out. But
Right.
and that's one of the things too with the carbon market. The biggest complaint I hear from people is, I've already been doing good management. Why should I sign up for something like this? Or I'm inherently missing out because I've already accumulated most of the soil organic carbon that my soil can hold, because it doesn't just keep accumulating forever. It eventually plateaus. But yeah, people don't realize the conservation easement route because it is relatively new and it hasn't been around very long. But yeah, it can go hand in hand. You can get paid for both, which is fantastic, and you can negotiate in your contract to also be able to sign up for conservation programs with an agency if you want to as well. So you can stack all of these different programs and kind of maximize a payment per acre for what you're doing.
Okay, so if we were to acquire a property that already had a conservation easement recorded on it, is there a way to then submit that for evaluation to potentially become part of the carbon credit program?
Yeah, and I don't think that's actually happened yet, which is something I've thought about, because even though you're putting your land in an easement, there's still improvements you can make. You can still accumulate more carbon from improving your management. And so I absolutely think that even if you've already put your land in an easement, you can still reach out and potentially join the carbon market as well. You just have to find another management change that you could do.
Okay, so they come in and they evaluate how you're currently operating over that conservation easement, and then if, like you'd mentioned, people are already implementing best practices and they've already sequestered as much carbon as possible, there's really not much opportunity for them to take advantage of some of these credits, but they could still technically sell those carbon credits on the market. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, kind of what I was saying is, you can't just keep accumulating carbon. At some point, you kind of reach your potential. And unfortunately, like you just don't have a lot of financial potential in the market. And, the people who have more degraded land are going to have more potential to make more money. But either way, you can send them your maps and get an idea of what they think you can make. And something strategic that I've been working with some lawyers on in terms of contract negotiation is writing a clause in your contract that says, if I don't make X dollars per acre by year 5, then I want to be able to get out of this contract. And I think that's important because if you're not making any money, it doesn't make sense to keep in the market and in the contract. But also, if you're not making money, the carbon company is not going to make money because they take a portion of the revenue. So it doesn't make sense to even keep the project going. And so having that clause in a contract is really important.
So I'm curious if we could go back to the example that you gave us before, where you had this gentleman who had pretty sizable acreage, and then they came back and they were only going to grant a conservation easement over a portion of that property. If all that he was going to do was, I get the whole in perpetuity restricting the land from being able to develop or do anything else, so that conservation easement, but if there is already a conservation easement, why, if you have the potential to generate some additional revenue from that, why wouldn't you want to move forward with taking advantage of having one of these companies come in to just pay you for even what minimal amount you could get?
Yeah, so you're kind of getting at why not just sign up? Sounds great. Well, the main reason is contract length. People don't want to tie themselves or their land up for 20 to 30 years. That's how long some of these contracts are. Specifically with older landowners that don't want to tie up the next generation. The other thing is, if you sell a property that's under a carbon contract, you have to find a buyer that's willing to continue that contract, or else you have to pay back for carbon that would be lost by terminating the project. And so I've talked to real estate agents about this because I'm curious on how does having a carbon contract impact how much you can sell property for? Because in one sense, it's like you have this revenue stream from the carbon project. Hopefully you're making money from it. So there's that, you already have this revenue stream, but at the same time, you're limited with what you can do on the property. Typically in my region and in the West, we're not doing a lot other than grazing on a lot of our land. So that risk is less. But if you're in the Midwest or you're in the Southeast where someone wants to come in and grow a bunch of row crops and till, well, that's going to be a major problem with selling property that's in a carbon contract.
Fascinating to see both sides. I I kind of equate it to like the whole solar panel on your home ordeal, right? Where if you put solar on and you're leasing the solar panels, and then you want to sell the property and the new buyer doesn't want to take over that lease, right? Then you're obviously going to have to pay the penalty to get the panels removed, but also for that energy offset that they had originally accounted for when they structured the lease. So
yeah, it's exactly like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that makes total sense. In one of the more positive examples of something that you've worked in, where you're talking about having these companies come in and actually pay for the improvements, that to me is kind of fascinating. Where Chris and I have a property, and it's 1,000 acres, and we've signed some grazing leases so that we don't necessarily have the grazing operation, or we don't have the cattle operation ourselves, but we've leased it out to another operator who can bring his cattle on. But we want to be able to take advantage of this and put some fencing up, we can get that fully funded in some instances to make sure that we're maximizing the carbon sequestration, and we're also getting paid more because we are therefore maximizing the carbon sequestration and increasing the value of the carbon credits. Is that right?
Yeah, and so kind of how it works is you'll meet with a ranch advisor that the carbon company gives every project, and you guys come up with like your strategy for your management for the carbon project. And so if you're thinking of a grazing plan, you have to look at the property and look at what makes sense. For 1,000 acres, I don't know if virtual fencing makes sense. Maybe it depends on how many animals. Um, but virtual fencing could be an option, and they will pay for that. Or maybe temporary or electric fence is a better option. One of the biggest kind of limitations to being able to distribute livestock more evenly over the landscape is water. And so if you can potentially develop some kind of water tanks pipeline, maybe that's an option as well. And so kind of how it works is they will give you prepayments for that management change. So let's say it costs 50 grand for all of these changes. They'll give you that money ahead of time. And then after all the soil sampling in year 5, when they come back and you've accumulated a bunch of carbon, it's going to make a ton of money. That's great. But what they're going to do is they're going to subtract that 50 grand that they gave you initially from that revenue in year 5. And then they have all these project costs. It costs tens of thousands of dollars for a carbon project, between getting it registered and verified. Soil sampling is extremely expensive. So they're going to subtract all of those costs that they put into the project as well. And then they're going to take a portion of the revenue. And so I don't know how much money we're going to see in year 5 if we're getting virtual fencing put on our cows, because virtual fencing, let's say with halter, it's $96 a head, and that's for satellite collars. And so, it's an expensive startup cost for questionable revenue after 5 years.
Sure. Is there, in these contracts that you're seeing, is the landowner assuming any risk if the amount of carbon sequestered in the soil comes back below what they had expected?
Yeah, and that is like the most important thing, and that's what I think about is like the risk on the landowner. Because you can be doing everything you said you would do, and you're doing everything for what you signed up for in your contract. You could have a prairie dog kingdom move in, you could have a grasshopper infestation, you could have wildfire, you could have drought. All of these things that are out of your hand. And so carbon companies today have, this is one of the reasons I think they've improved. They're accounting for these changes that can occur outside of the landowner's control. And they're called unavoidable losses of carbon. So carbon being lost from something you couldn't help. And so in the contracts, they basically say that if carbon is lost from any of those cases, the landowner is not responsible to pay back. And that is so important to have in a contract. The only time a landowner is responsible to pay back for carbon loss is if they go out and do something against what their contract says. I don't know why they would, but if they decide they want to go till, they're going to have to pay back for that carbon, which makes sense. That's what you signed up for. So really the risk here is investing all this time and not accumulating a lot of carbon and not making money, which is why I'm saying it's important to have in that your contract that clause that says if I'm not making X dollars, I want out. Because it's just not worth being enrolled, in my opinion, if you're not making money. So that's kind of the big risk, is time and tying up your property. And if you want to sell, or the next generation, you don't have a good succession plan and there's turmoil, then that's another risk as well of what's going to happen to the property. But yeah, the market has evolved today where it's like if carbon is unavoidably lost, the landowner's not responsible for paying it back.
So what are some of your conversations like with real estate agents where, you're talking to them and, trying to increase the value of the land perhaps through this mechanism?
Yeah. So this is kind of funny. So my fiance actually works in real estate. He works for Hayden Outdoors Farm and Ranch Real Estate. And so I'm always talking with agents because they're selling big ranches and farms. And a lot of the questions that they get from buyers is, how can I diversify this property? How can I make more money from this property? Because a lot of the people buying these large farms and ranches are absentee landowners, um, or maybe just want another stream of revenue. And the carbon market can absolutely be that for any of those types of people. You just have to be willing to sign that contract. That's the biggest barrier, is signing a 20 or 30-year contract. Although there are some that are five or 10 years, but still, it's a time commitment. And really it can be as simple as, I'm just going to move cows more frequently and rest pastures longer. And that's your change. That's all you have to do. And so if you have people who are progressive and willing to join a carbon market like that, absolutely can add a stream of revenue. It can, even if the project doesn't make any money, you're still investing in infrastructure. And investing meaning you're signing up for a carbon company who will invest financially in that, but you're making ranch improvements, not at your own dime. And then just the idea that you're improving your management, which is going to have non-financial benefits, like more organic matter, more grass, more ecological outcomes that you can't necessarily put a dollar value to. But, if you're trying to gain weight on cattle, you need grass to do that. So if you can grow more grass, that's a win. So
Yeah. Would this also make your farm operation? Would you be able to then say, listen, this is also regenerative farming?
yeah, so that's a good question. There's this whole marketing side to the carbon market. So like these carbon companies, they take into account all of the emissions that come from the operation itself. So that's calculated within this carbon credit determination. And so basically, if you're producing beef, that's carbon neutral beef because you're offsetting all of your own emissions from your operation. And so you could absolutely market, this is carbon neutral beef, or this is carbon neutral peanuts, or whatever, you're growing on that property. And people would eat that up. So there's this whole other marketing side. And just in terms of like having a landowner, come on to a marketing video for their ranch website and say, we really care about, improving our soil health. We're offsetting all of our own emissions by moving our cows more and resting pastures longer. So there's that whole marketing side that I don't think most people are thinking about, but it is there.
I mean, it makes me think. So, I mean, I go to the grocery store and I'm looking at labels and I see regenerative farming, regeneratively grown or whatever. And so I'm thinking, okay, a savvy landowner is going to say, okay, look, I'm going to rotate my cattle. It's going to be better anyway. I'm going to get paid by selling off carbon credits. And then I'm going to be able to package on the beef label that this is carbon neutral or zero carbon beef that's also regeneratively farmed, right? And so you're winning, they're kind of winning multiple different ways, making more money. And then, like you said, getting the marketing benefit of stamping those on the labels, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, I don't know if anyone's doing what you just described, but there's definitely opportunity there because the market's so new that a lot of people have signed up, but they haven't reached that 5-year mark to actually be issued credits. And the market is public. You can track it. And I, for some reason, decide to track it. And so I see when carbon credits are being sold, and it's not very many. But I think when I think about 10 years down the line, I think a lot of what you described is what we're going to start to see, especially with people's concerns with emissions from the beef industry.
Mm-hmm.
I think producers need to take advantage of the marketing opportunities as well. Regenerative, carbon-friendly beef. Absolutely, I see that in the future.
Gotcha. Yeah. So is the 1,000 acres, back to the size, is the 1,000 acres common across the whole US, or is that more of, do you think, like a Wyoming thing? Can you do it with smaller parcels elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it's a Wyoming thing. for example, we probably, we get 10 to 14 inches of rain here. And precipitation is one of the biggest influences on how much carbon you can accumulate. So, if you're in a different region where you get a lot more rain or you have, more organic matter in your soil, maybe you'll make more money. Thus, you don't need as many acres. But in Wyoming, to make a profitable project, you probably need thousands of acres. But I don't think that it's like that across the country. Like I said, we're high and dry here. Laramie, we're at 7,200 feet. We can only grow so much grass here, because we're so limited by our climate. But if you're in an area where you're not limited by your climate, then yeah, a lot more potential for more revenue.
Okay. All right. So let's just have some fun here, and let's put your consulting hat on, and maybe we'll drag your fiance in here as well. And let's say that we want to buy a piece of land, and we want to buy and hold it for a while. We want to kind of land bank it, and we've found that there's a path of growth, but it's probably 10 years off, but we have some extra money that we want to really like just put into land and let the land sit there for a while in the path of growth. And, we know we're not going to do anything with it for 10, maybe 20 years. And we're not even going to farm it though. We're just going to, just to kind of make it simple, we're not going to farm it necessarily, but we want to, maybe make some sort of income stream off it. And in the meantime, how do we go about doing that in our due diligence? Like, do we come to you and say, hey, Nikki, I'm looking at this property. It's 2,000 acres. It's in the path of growth. At some point, they're going to develop this, probably 20 years down the road. Can we do like a feasibility study on it? And then you dive in and start doing that with us? Or how does that look for someone that's analyzing a piece of property to buy?
Yeah, well, this sounds like Colorado. So let's act like this is a property in Colorado. And it's because there's just not a lot of people that are like me and don't have like a foot in the game and make money from the carbon market. So there's not like a lot of unbiased opinions out there. But one of the things I would recommend to people is kind of write down, your goals for the property and a realistic change in management you'd be willing to make. And if it's Colorado, absolutely throw some cows on there. There is a long list of people that are looking for land to graze on. Custom grazing is a very popular business nowadays, especially with young people not being able to afford to buy land. So there is a lot of people looking to run their cow somewhere. And so I think one of the first things I would do is contact Cultivo and Grassroots and Native and say, I'm interested in signing up with a carbon project with you. Here's a KMZ of my ranch. Tell me what you think. And I am willing to, rotationally graze. And I think also, again, going back to what you're willing to do, if maybe not virtual fencing, but just subdividing pastures and letting the person who's going to be running cattle on your place decide how to manage the land, especially if you're not going to live in Colorado. And so I think, you have to find someone who has a custom grazing business that's willing to do this carbon contract management that you're going to decide upon. And yeah, kind of go from there. And those carbon companies will give you an idea, like I said. The other thing that people don't realize is there's this general conservation program application with the NRCS. So I would fill that out and check all the boxes, and they will give you an idea of if you're in a carbon contract, you can still enroll in these programs. For example, they'll pay you for rotational grazing per acre. They'll potentially do cost share on water development as well. So stacking carbon programs with a conservation program with the NRCS. And that right there is, you could do that in a day, filling out, or reaching out to those carbon companies as well as filling out some conservation programs with NRCS.
Yeah. I'm curious about this. So Michael and I bought 40 acres in Colorado, which may be too small, I don't know, but it's right in the middle of this huge 1,000-acre cattle operation. And I don't know I know they have a conservation easement on that 1,000 acres, but I know they run cattle. I don't know if I've always been curious, like, should we, because we just think we're probably going to develop a house on it at some point, something like that, and just go, use it as like a recreational property from time to time. But would there be a play where we could actually sell off something, some sort of carbon credits, but still develop a house, like sell off 39 acres of carbon credits and then develop a house? Or is there something that we could do maybe with the neighbors and let them run their cattle on our small piece of land and still make some money while the land is just sitting there?
Yeah, so you can absolutely, cut off an acre if you want to build a house and just not include that in the carbon project. You just have to know that before you sign the contract, to exclude some acreage for development. I think the only way that 40 acres would work for a carbon project in Colorado is if you joined with your neighbors, or kind of the way that they're enrolling 40 acres is aggregated projects, which means they're enrolling multiple landowners under one contract, because then the costs of getting the project going is a lot cheaper. And so that potentially is an option. You could reach out to Cultivo and say, we only have 40 acres. Is there any aggregated projects or anyone else signing up that we could join in on their contract?
Interesting. Okay. Cultivo and NRCS.
Mm-hmm.
Looking them up over here. All right, I see it. Cultivo.land. Does that sound right?
Yeah, CULTIVO. Mm-hmm.
So while Chris is looking at that, it's funny because our wheels are spinning here as to all the properties that we come across and some of the deals, and just always trying to figure out different ways to generate opportunity, right? And I think that this is a really cool way to do that in a sustainable way, which is also something that we want to stand behind. But from and I don't want to like hold you to any of these numbers, but can you give us any kind of an idea of the range of what the monetization piece could look like, right? Like, are we talking in like the thousands of dollars, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and obviously all size respective, but any ideas there?
Yeah, that's the $1,000,000 question that everyone wants to know. Because it's hard to answer because it varies. And carbon credits are, well, I should say the number of carbon credits you can generate per acre varies so much by where you're at. It varies like how much rain you get, your soil texture, how much grass you have. So it's all based on how much carbon you can accumulate over time. Um, so that's the hard part. I know that carbon credits are valued anywhere from $15 to $35, depending the company. How many credits can you generate per acre? I think in Wyoming, it's probably anywhere from a quarter to 2 credits an acre. So you can kind of do the math there. When I was first consulting for landowners back in 2023, these carbon companies were quoting ranchers, oh, you can make hundreds of thousands of dollars. We think in 5 years you'll make $130,000, which I remember I was like, come on, that's a little bit ambitious. The fact that you've actually never accumulated any carbon credits from any of your projects, I don't think you should be telling people that. So I've always erred on the side of caution, like don't expect to make a ton of money, because it just, people don't realize too, soil organic carbon takes a long time to accumulate, which is why these contracts are a lot of time. So yeah, it kind of varies. Some contracts and carbon companies will vary in their payment structure. So kind of like what I said, they'll give you prepayments before you get going to make the management changes. And then some companies will pay you $1 an acre in between those sampling times, year 1 and 5, just to kind of like incentivize you to stay in the project. Again, that's going to be subtracted. All that money you got is going to be subtracted from that revenue you get in year 5. But yeah, I've seen anywhere from $1 to $3 per acre in those off years. In terms of percent of revenue, it's changed. When I first started, contracts were 80% of total revenue goes to the landowner. It has since gone down because I think carbon companies are realizing how expensive these projects are. And so one thing I tell landowners is negotiate the heck out of your contract. Like there's so few that I think that they're willing to be very flexible. So one of the things I always say is negotiate the payment, the dollar per acre payment higher, and negotiate your revenue sharing higher. You should be making at least 60% of the profits. You're the one doing the work. All they're doing is, soil sampling, and they're hiring someone else to do it. So it's your land. You should be making at least 60% of that revenue every 5 years when resampling occurs. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of having a clause. If I don't make this much money in total, whether that's if I don't make $100,000 in 5 years, or I don't make $20 an acre after 5 years or every 5 years, I want out of the contract. So those are kind of the dollar figures I can give you, but it's really hard because so few people have actually earned carbon credits and reached that 5-year mark.
Yeah. So just rough math. You're saying $20 an acre. That is possible in certain areas. Maybe not in Wyoming, but in certain areas, and it could be higher, it could be lower, but $20 an acre per year?
Per every 5 years.
Per every 5 years.
Yeah, so it's they sample year 0, they resample in year 5. And so
Okay.
I'm saying I think over 5 years, maybe. I don't know. It varies so much. It's really hard to give an estimate, but I think $20 an acre is possible.
Okay. That's cool. Yeah. So I think that just gives a baseline, right? And obviously the market price is going to change. It's dynamic, and you have competition that's going to come in, and that's going to have an influence on it. But if you're just kind of back of the napkin trying to do some math here and just see, is this even worth me considering doing and tying up the property, and or is that going to generate enough revenue for me to fund some of the change management that I want to incorporate on the property? That to me seems like it's a really good starting point to just run that analysis and see if it's something you want to move forward with.
Yeah, and again, just sending them your maps and they'll give you an idea. They'll say, we think you will generate this many carbon credits. And they'll give you an idea. How accurate that is, I don't know, because I think they're using remote sensing modeling to do that, and there's some inaccuracies with that. But they'll give you an idea, And I think at the end of the day, it's important to remember that they're not going to sign you up if they don't think you're not going to make money, because however much money you make is how much money they make in proportion. So, yeah.
Super cool. We're kind of running out of time here, but I did want to ask you, is there anything, and there may not be, but anything that's kind of cutting edge, innovative, surprising to you that has just recently come out in regards to this that we haven't already talked about?
I mean, I think the whole thing is new and innovative. The whole market is, in terms of comparing it to the past. I think, yeah, it's just so hard because there's so few people doing it, and there's just not a lot of people to talk about with the market. I do have some papers out in terms of considerations that you should think of in terms of the entire market. I also sent a survey to 3,500 producers in the Great Plains and asked them what they thought. And I had about 50% that were genuinely interested. And then there was a small portion of people who wrote profanity on my survey and were very fired up. So I think we have a mixed bag of how people feel about the carbon market. Some people think it's like the government trying to take your property rights. Other people see it as, another stream of revenue you can add to the property. But I think asking lots of questions and shopping around is the two most important things. And no question, I mean, nothing is off the table. I remember when I first started consulting, I would sit at tables with landowners and carbon companies and just ask anything, because I think you got to put, salesmen on the spot and see how they respond.
Yeah. And with such a new innovative space, I mean, who knows? If you don't ask for it, you might not get it.
Exactly. And you can say, well, Grassroots said they were going to do this for me. They're giving me more money. Can you beat them? Otherwise, I'm going to go sign up with them.
Nikki, how do people get in touch with you if they, first of all, do you only work in the state of Wyoming? And then second, how do people get in touch with you if they want to get consulting?
Yeah, so I won't work just in the state of Wyoming. I will take calls from other people, which ever since I've started this, actually, that has been happening. I probably get calls every other week, because I can provide an unbiased opinion and I won't charge you for it. So give me a call or email me. You can email me at nnimlos@uwyo.edu and ask me any questions there. And yeah, that's probably the best way.
Awesome. I think that people can get, number one, they'll get a lot of value out of just listening to this podcast. In some respects, I feel like I'm leaving with a lot more questions right now. And I want to go out and like look at some of the properties that we have and be like, you know what, does this make sense? And, but I feel like, reaching out to you and utilizing you as like a consultant would be really valuable for a lot of people. And so if they can reach you through that email, that's great. Um, and this has just been a super eye-opening podcast in a lot of ways, just for, for us as land investors. And I think land investors, especially that are doing, I guess, transactions in some of the areas that you mentioned where these carbon credits could be very lucrative, and land investors that are doing, deals with properties that are pretty large acreage wise. It could make a lot of sense to start to fold this into their strategy. So really appreciate you jumping on with us. And yeah, I think that's probably about a wrap. So appreciate you jumping on with us, Nikki.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks
Nikki.
for having me.
This has been amazing. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the Modern Land Investor Podcast. This has been a Neon Mixtape production and produced by Ryan Gonzalez. If you like the podcast, please like and subscribe.